After the Civil War, Black and white preachers, politicians, activists, leaders lobbied Congress for a separate educational system for Black people. During that time, the prevailing wisdom was that the conditions that Blacks experienced during slavery left them in such a condition that the Black community needed a separate educational system in order to be able to address the unique needs of Black people separate and apart from whites. So this became the practice and the prevailing rules, and eventually became became part of the law by Supreme Court decision in the 1890s, 1896 or so, of Plessy versus Ferguson, that established the separate but equal doctrine. After Plessy, school systems began to develop that were publicly funded all across the country. And these publicly funded school systems were always separate, but never equal. And more resources would always be distributed to the white schools. Black schools would get kind of the hand-me-down. They'd get the hand-me-down books, the hand-me-down buses, if any. Some Black children had to walk 20 miles to go to school and walk home. And so the system did not accommodate the Black community and Black progress. And so leaders of the NAACP and many other Black organizations and some white organizations began to struggle to and advocate for the end of segregated system so that Black people would have an equal chance in American society. Something happened, though, during this period that's very often overlooked. Around 1915, the Sons and Daughters of Confederate Veterans, which was an organization of the descendants of Confederate soldiers, erected monuments all across the country. And many of these monuments, these Confederate monuments, erected on courthouses, state houses, particularly across the South, had a inscription or emblem on it, on a plaque that said "Dio Vindici," God will vindicate. Its meaning in Latin, and this became a rallying point for people who believed, based on the old Southern belief system, that Black people should be in slavery perpetually, because that's what the Confederate Constitution provided, that all Black people, even free Black people, would be placed in slavery and will remain perpetually in slavery. And so that was what the South was fighting for. So having lost the war, around 1915, the Sons and Daughters of Confederate Veterans became organized and began to get people on local school boards, and they began to take action to influence the curriculum of public schools. And so they pushed the concept that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, and to diminish the issue of slavery, and to actually attempt to whitewash what had happened to Black people in this country, and the history that Black people were excluded in the Constitution per the Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857. Supreme Court basically said that Blacks have no rights, which whites are bound to respect. That Blacks are not citizens of the United States. They were not contemplated in the Constitution. And it took the 14th Amendment, it took the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, and the 14th Amendment to confer citizenship upon Black people. So Black people did not become U.S. citizens until the 14th Amendment, which was passed around 1868. And so around 1915, this group, the Sons and Daughters of Confederate veterans, still resisting the acceptance of Black people into society, basically, began to whitewash the history in order to obscure the truth, to hide what actually happened. And this thinking and this method, this way, permeated school systems across the country and affected how teachers learned, what they learned, and what was taught in school. And so they developed a whole system where, in elementary school, you'd learn to recite some passages out of the Constitution, or you learn to recite the preamble to the Constitution. You'd learn the language that, about all men are created equal, and you'd learn the language that seemed like it was unification language, that didn't explain. There was no explanation that when the Declaration of Independence was written, and when the Constitution was written, and when the expression or phrase "we the people" was made in those founding documents, they obscured the fact that Black people were excluded during the time that it was written. In addition to that, they they talk about the patriotic things that were done in terms of the heroes, and they'll mention Crispus Attucks. And I remember a teacher once hearing a teacher once say, well, Crispus Attucks, he was a rabble rouser, he was a troublemaker, and he got shot. And they don't cast him as he was the first person to die in the cause of American freedom. They don't put an emphasis on the 5,000 troops, Black troops that helped to liberate America, that fought in the in the American Revolutionary Army. And they don't tell you about those things, those achievements that Black people brought to help move the country forward. They don't tell you about Black inventors and scientists. They may mention a few, but for the most part, the public school curriculum is devoid of anything that really champions the issues of what Blacks achieved or the struggles that they experienced and went through. And this has come down today where Blacks have been pushing for, and even some whites have been pushing for, the truth to be told in the public education system, and that the curriculums reflect what happened. That if you talk about George Washington, you should talk about the fact that he was a slave owner, that he didn't free any of his slaves during his lifetime. He put in his will that his slaves would get freed after he died and after his wife died. They didn't talk about the fact that Thomas Jefferson had a whole Black family that he kept hidden. They don't talk about the fact that Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner and he acted similar to George Washington. They don't tell you about the negative public statements that that Thomas Jefferson made, suggesting that his feeling that Blacks were somehow inferior. They don't tell us about the various presidents leading up to the Civil War, and in whether they held slaves and what their position was in terms of the issue of slavery. They don't tell us about the Civil War from the Black perspective. They don't share those important things that took place during the Civil War, or what molded and shaped and affected the consciousness of Black people. and white people in the United States that brought about change. They'll tell you, about Harper's Ferry, but they won't tell you about Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey or Gabriel Prosser. They won't tell you about the movement of Black people as abolitionists in their struggle to bring about change. They'll mention a few characters and they'll tell you about Thomas Garrett, and they'll tell you about what whites did. So the curriculum is designed in such a way that it obscures what Black people achieved or the struggles that Black people went through to bring about change. And now there's an effort to get this information into the public school curriculums. There's an effort to get teachers educated about what happened, because so many teachers have been miseducated and they don't know some of the information. When you talk about critical race theory, many of the teachers, they don't know enough history or information about Black people to really authoritatively or effectively talk about it or discuss it with students in class. So there's a gap in their learning. And so these are some of the issues of our times of how do we bring this information to the forefront? How do we make teachers knowledgeable about what happened to Black people and what the Black experience has consisted of, what the struggles are that Black people have gone through? We need to talk about lynching and what happened during a period of time when lynching was at an all-time high in America of Black people. We need to talk about some of the things that took place during Jim Crow, besides maybe talking about, Brown versus Board of Education and talking about school desegregation or the Little Rock Nine. We need to go beyond that and talk about some of the other important struggles that took place that opened doors and that helped change minds and that moved things forward. We need to go, we need to examine the age of Black organizations and begin to look at the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the impact that it had on the thinking of Black America and Americans in general. We need to go back and look at organizations like the Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple of America. We need to look at the sleeping car porters. We need to look at the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and so many other organizations up through even the Black Panthers. We only hear negative stuff presented about the Black Panthers. We don't hear about their feeding programs or what they actually stood for. And when we look at history and we learn about the COINTELPRO program and what J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI did to try to infiltrate Black organizations and discredit Black leaders and to try to destroy the progress of Black people, and the role that the government played in the destruction in the Black community. We don't talk about that. We don't have that as a discussion. That's not part of what is taught in the public education system. I recognize the fact that things have to be presented in an age-appropriate fashion, but there's a lot of information that can be presented even starting in kindergarten that begins to tell the story, that begins to help us gain a better understanding of what has happened in the past so that we can develop the mindset to change the future and to make things better going forward. And I believe that it would improve race relations. It will improve the quality of life that we have and how we treat each other and interact with each other if we just learn the truth and learn the real facts about what has happened and understand why Black people are in the condition that they're in throughout this country right now, why the average white family has 17 to 20 times the wealth of the average Black family, the wealth accumulation, and what happened to make it that way. and to look at what has created the conditions to put Black people in a position where, we're 20 to 40 points behind on educational assessment tests and public education system, to look at our incarceration rates, to look at the health disparities in our communities, and to look at the conditions that Black people suffer under every day, to look at how these things came into being, how they came about, how that came into existence, and what the resistance has been to Black progress. These are things that need to be talked about. We need an open and frank discussion about it throughout the community. And we need to be able to look at it and understand it and to address it intelligently in such a way that we are able to reconcile each other so that we can come together, have an understanding, and make mutual progress. Because the future of this country depends on our ability to be able to get along and to be able to understand each other and to look out for each other's mutual interests, because we are moving in a direction where this country is going to fall apart, and we're going to be in a condition of chaos and in trouble as has not been seen in this country. And just because in this country we have not in quite a while faced a war on our soil, we've forgotten. We don't think of what it would be like living in Ukraine today with the average person who their house is getting blown up, or that person who, their parents just got shot, their brother, their sister, their child, there's no grocery store down the street, it got bombed. They don't have good access to running water or other types of the basic necessities of life. They don't have access to it because of conditions of war. That can come to American soil, and we can experience this. There can be chaos right here in this country, and we have to work together to prevent that from happening. There are outsiders who want to come in and agitate us, to polarize our community, to make it the Democrats against the Republican, and the Blacks against the whites, and the religious community against the non-religious community, and the community of morality versus the community of gays and homosexuals. And they want to create a polarity, a division, and create such a deep divide that they cause the community to plummet into chaos. Now, there are some who will benefit from that happening. So you have people who are demagogues who seek that to happen because they benefit from it. And they seek, they wouldn't care if we all went into a state of destruction so that they could personally benefit. So there are people like that out there, and we have to recognize that, and we have to protect ourselves against it. So I urge you today to take the time to sit down and talk with somebody about these subjects, and hold an intelligent conversation. Do some research, some study, so that you can learn and gain an understanding. And it's time for change.